Historically, our approach to motivating ourselves and others has been built on the concept of external rewards, what some call the carrot and stick approach. What we believe about motivation, and consequently what we practice in schools and in the workplace, has profound implications for just about everything humans do or attempt to do. So what happens if we're getting it wrong? Which is exactly what our guest thinks we're doing. In his new book, he addresses the gap between what science knows and what business does. This week on Dialogue, Drive, the surprising truth about what motivates us. Hello again and welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. I'm John Molesky. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. Our guest today is Daniel Pink. Dan Pink is the author of a number of best-selling books, including A Whole New Mind, a long-running New York Times bestseller that has been translated into 20 languages. He has contributed to the New York Times, Harvard Business Review, Fast Company, and Wired, and is a frequent lecturer on economic transformation and changes in the workplace. His latest work is this book, Drive, the surprising truth about what motivates us. Welcome to Dialogue, Dan. Thanks for joining us.
John, it's my pleasure.
Let me ask you first a little background on the decision to write a book about motivation. Why you decide? What motivated you to write about motivation? Is the pun begging to be said?
Right. Well, it was a few things. I mean, I had written a book called A Whole New Mind about the move from left brain abilities, logical linear abilities, to right brain artistic empathic abilities. And in response to that, people asked me, if you're right, or you're more right than wrong, how do we get people to do these things? How do we motivate people to do that kind of work? And I didn't have a clue.
The question kept coming up, and you decided you better try to answer it?
Yeah, I mean, I was curious, too. It's a great question. How do you motivate people to do more artistic, empathic, creative work? But I didn't have an answer. I knew there was a body of research on human motivation, and so I started looking at it, and what I discovered was that it was a treasure trove of research, and it also said some very surprising things. It ended up, at least for me, calling into question orthodoxies that I didn't even realize were orthodoxies.
How far back does the body of research go? Is
well, in this regard, there's almost sort of a big bang in the research of a guy named Harry Harlow, who did a bunch of experiments, actually ended up becoming reasonably famous, did a bunch of experiments with monkeys, and what he discovered one day when he was teaching some monkeys how to do puzzles is that before he even started teaching them, he was going to use a system of rewards to teach them how to do puzzles. He left the monkeys alone, and they started playing with the puzzles on their own and figuring it out, which you weren't allowed to do. It's like no one would ever do anything except for some raisins, or a monkey wouldn't do anything except for some raisins. No. And he said, wow, we haven't seen this behavior before. They're unprompted. They're going after these puzzles, figuring them out, doing it with gusto, doing it with a sense of enjoyment, and yet they're not being rewarded by anything from the outside. Maybe it's its own reward. And that was sort of...
big aha moment for him.
Well, it's funny. It was an aha moment for him, but it was so controversial, this idea, because the whole world of psychology was that primates, including us, we are rational calculators of rewards and punishments. We respond to external stimuli, and that's how it worked. And so he actually ended up dropping that and pursuing other things because it was so controversial. About 2 decades later, several other scholars began picking it up and created this body of research that extends to today.
Speaking of those aha moments, for you, when you were looking at this body of work, when did it click for you that the way we seek to motivate now is the wrong way, or isn't working, or has become antiquated?
Well, it's interesting because I think I always had a little gut sense of this, and I think a lot of people have a gut sense of this. That if you think about your own behavior, I mean, obviously everybody wants to be paid, and no one, but we also want to do things because they're interesting. We want to do things because they contribute. We want to do things because they're meaningful. And in many ways, different accounts of explanations of behavior didn't have room for that. So if you think about, when I studied economics, that wasn't even in the conversation. It was, you were a rational calculator of your economic self-interest, and you did what was wealth maximizing. And I said, well, I don't always behave that way. Sometimes I do things that are against my wealth maximization interest because they're cool, they're interesting, they're fun, they're the right thing to do.
And you see that in politics, this constant, people vote against their self-interest.
Oh, that's an interesting point. Yeah, people do, because that's a very good point. I hadn't actually thought about that, because they're motivated by values or by other kinds of things. And so, so for me, there wasn't a single aha moment. What the aha moment to me was that you have this, 50 years of research that says that these carrot and stick motivators, if you do this, then you get that. They're sometimes effective, but in a huge number of cases, they don't work very well.
Was the research consistent across cultural barriers? In other words, is this a global template?
It's interesting, yeah. It's a little bit of an open question, but the answer is probably. That is, according to some of these theories, what really motivates people is a sense of autonomy, a sense of getting better at something that matters, a sense of doing something purposeful. And that is a human impulse. It has different expressions, I think, across cultures. And there's some research, particularly on autonomy, that says that this idea that we want to direct our own lives is a human impulse. It might look differently. It might look different in the United States versus the former Soviet Union versus Korea.
Yeah. You say in the book that societies have operating systems.
Yeah.
Explain what you mean by that.
Well, if you think about what computer operates, I wrote a book using the brain as a metaphor, but if that, I didn't think that was quite nerdy enough, so I thought, let's write a book. Let's write a book using the computer operating system as the animating metaphor. If you think about what a computer operating system is, it's sort of a layer of instructions that we don't really think about, pretty much beneath the programs that we actually use each day. And we don't think about operating systems until they fail us and things crash. And so, early on, 50,000 years ago, the human operating system was basically about survival. We were trying to outrun the saber-toothed tiger and reproduce and get our genes into the next generation.
That's motivation 1.0, as you call it.
1.0, all right? Now, that's an important motivator. That's a great motivation system for outrunning saber-toothed tigers and living in tiny little clans. If you want to have a more elaborate social system involving trade and commerce, you need something else. So we upgraded to motivation 2.0, which is built around rewards and punishments and those kinds of external incentives. And that is, when you think about that, take 3 steps back and look at that, that's just an amazing human achievement.
The move from 1.0 to 2.0.
Yeah, the whole invention of 2.0, this idea that
we're more than our biology.
Yeah, exactly. It's a huge achievement. It doesn't get enough credit. It's why we had the Industrial Revolution. In some sense, it's why the world is so wealthy. It's a brilliant human innovation. The trouble is that I think that motivational operating system has sort of hit its limits. That motivational operating system, these external rewards and punishments, is very good for relatively simple, straightforward tasks. And that's what most people did at work for a long time in this country and other countries, for several hundred
The assembly
years.
Line worker.
Turning the same
farmer.
screw the same way over and over again. Or even in office. You had people in white-collar offices, processing paper, adding up columns of figures, very kind of routine, rule-based work. Those kinds of motivators, the if-then motivators, are pretty good for those. They get people to focus, concentrate, get their job done, do it the right way. The problem is that as that kind of work becomes less valuable, it can be offshored, it can be automated. What really matters are these more creative, conceptual things, human interaction, iterating something the world didn't know it was missing, empathy, design thinking, solving complex problems. And what this body of research that we were talking about earlier shows is that for that kind of work, these if-then motivators don't work very well, and they actually often backfire.
What are the factors? What evolves that make this system no longer applicable? Is it an evolution of the type of work we do? Is it a human evolution? Is it people are changing? What are the things?
I'm not sure whether it's people are changing, because I think people have always done creative and have always done creative conceptual work and made new discoveries. What's interesting, if you look at some of the discoveries, is how much they were prompted basically by someone's internal desire to figure something out. They weren't saying, oh, I'm going to go discover the law of gravity because it's going to make me rich. They're saying, oh, wait a second, that apple just fell on my head. What the heck's that about? What's going on here? I think what's gone on, especially in work, is that fewer of us are doing these kinds of routine, algorithmic sort of work. We have software that does that. There's a huge amount of work going overseas. So the basic computer programming, basic financial analysis is increasingly migrating to places where folks will do it for, 1/3, 1/4 of what's happening here. And if you look at the content of white-collar work today, it relies much more on creative capabilities, on understanding other people, on coming up with something new, and on solving really, really complex problems. And again, what this research shows over and over again, and we can talk about some of the studies if you want, is that those kinds of motivators don't work.
Let's talk about one of the studies, one that I recall that I found particularly interesting about school children with art projects.
Oh.
Tell us what happened.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's actually a really well-known one, and there's a whole body on that too. Yeah, so this is one of the dangers of these kinds of external, particularly contingent if-then rewards. So there was a group of preschoolers in, this is research done at Stanford, so a group of preschoolers in Northern California. And what they did, the researchers, they watched these preschool classes, and they found the students who were most interested, students who during their free play time drew. Because, little kids love to draw, a lot of little kids love to draw. So these are kids who during the free play time like to draw. So they took those kids who like to draw during the free play time, they took them off, later on and did a little experiment. They divided them into 3 groups. On one group, they handed them some crayons and some paper and said, draw if you want to. Second group, they said, here's some crayons and paper, draw if you want to. If they did draw, they ended up getting a little certificate at the end saying, congratulations, great draw, or something like that.
They didn't know that.
They didn't know. It wasn't promised to them. It was just sort of unexpected at the end. The third group, they said, here's some crayon and paper. If you draw, you get this big shiny certificate with your name on it. Okay? So, and what happened is that the kids in every group drew, because these kids in this first group drew because they like to draw. The kids in the second group drew. They didn't know a reward was coming. They drew. The kids in the third group drew too because they liked to draw, and they were getting a little prize for it. What was interesting is they followed up then 2 weeks later and watched, and then this research is so amazing because there's a sort of sinister side to it, because a lot of it involves two-way mirrors and deception and so forth. And so they're watching through a two-way mirror, these students in this preschool class, to see what they're doing during their free play time. Kids in that first group, not promised a reward beforehand, not given one afterward, they're still drawing during free play time. Second group, the group that wasn't promised a reward in advance, but that got one at the end, they're still drawing during free play time, which is really important. The third group that was promised one at the beginning and given one at the end, they lost interest in drawing. Drawing became something you did to get the prize. And in the absence of a prize, what's the point?
And then you mentioned that surveys of professional artists say that when they're commissioned to work, same result.
Well, that's actually, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's I think that's one of the most interesting ones out there. This is a great study. What it was is they took 20-something artists, 23 or so artists, and they said, give me 10 of your commission, randomly select 10 of your commissioned works and 10 of your non-commissioned works. And then they took, so it's 20 works times something like 23 artists, 460 works of art. And they showed them to an expert panel who had no idea what was going on. And this expert panel of curators and museum directors and artists evaluate these pieces of art. It turned out that the evaluation showed there was no difference in technical skill. But when they rated them on creativity, the non-commissioned pieces were almost uniformly rated as more creative. And that really surprises people, because you would think, it surprised me a little bit too, because I would think, as a writer who, I do commissions, and I think, well, God, if you got that commission out there, you're going to do your work.
This is the work that pays the bills.
Yeah, so of course you're going to be more motivated, and you are in a technical way, but in less of the creative way. And what's interesting there are two things interesting about that. One is that the commissions where the commissioner gave people enormous amounts of autonomy, those works were rated as creative. So there are different ways to offer a commission. What's interesting about the workplace, and even especially schools, if you analogize, is that almost everything we do is commissioned.
Absolutely.
Everything kids do in school is basically commissioned work.
So how far away are we from adopting essentially Motivation 3.0 and abandoning 2.0? I mean, it still is the bedrock on which everything is built. I was thinking of my daughter and my son. Favorite teacher of theirs was somebody who gave out Jolly Ranchers after they concluded a test or something like that. So everyone is still doing the reward and punishment model.
Sure, and it makes sense in a way because it's how we've always done things. It's pretty easy. I mean, it's pretty easy to measure, easy to implement, and it actually works in the short term. That is, if you offer me, $100 for doing something, you got my attention, John. I'll do it. You'll get activity out of me, and so it works in the short term. I think we're.
We'll try it again next week or the week after it runs out of steam.
You asked me to jump over this table for $100. I'm out of my seat, over the table. All right. You ask me to jump over the table the next time, and you don't pay me? No way. Yeah. And next time I'm out my $150.
So what are the elements of Motivation 3.0?
Well, it's a sense of autonomy, that is self-direction, doing things of our own volition.
So you're not constantly managed. You get to choose.
Well, you mentioned an important word, manage. I mean, management, in business, we tend to think of as something that God delivered to us, or that emanated from nature,
or some other entity, but maybe from the other side of the equation.
Okay, right, or from lower, but management is just something some guy invented. It hasn't always been. It's not like a river, or here in Washington, there's a Potomac River. We never think about, well, where did the Potomac River came from? We just say, oh, it's pretty much always been, for our purposes, it's essentially always been here, and we think that way about management, but it's not true. Some guy invented it, and it's a technology, in a sense, for organizing people into productive capacities. It's a technology designed to get compliance. Mm-hmm. And for creative work, you don't want compliance, you want engagement. And the path to engagement is self-direction. People controlling their time, who they work with, what they actually do, how they do it. And there's some interesting examples of companies taking these kind of radical approaches to autonomy.
And then you talk about mastery.
Mastery, Mastery is our desire to get better at stuff. We like to get better at stuff because we like to get better at stuff. It's inherently satisfying. And this goes to some of your earlier, what we're talking about earlier. If you think about someone playing, the viola on the weekend, okay, it doesn't satisfy their biological urges, probably. It doesn't make them any money, typically. So why do they do it? I mean, at some level, in biological and economic terms, it's irrational behavior. Mm-hmm. Why do they do it? Because it's interesting, because they get better at it, because it's inherently satisfying. And that's a profound human motivator, but unfortunately routinely neglected inside of companies.
Which leads to the third element, purpose.
Right, which is we want to do stuff in the service of something larger than ourselves.
Work with meaning, life with meaning.
Work with meaning, life with meaning, and not even meaning with a capital M or purpose with a capital P, just people, I think all of us want to make a contribution. We want what we do to matter in some way, not necessarily ending world hunger, but just, you want this show, people to watch it and say, wow, that was interesting. That made me think about things differently. You don't want to just sort of throw it into the ether.
Right.
What's the point?
Absolutely.
And I think a lot of times people are disengaged from a sense of purpose. And one of the things that you see out there is, in some ways, sort of the inadequacy, especially in for-profit companies, of the profit motive. That is, if you're inside of a company and the rallying cry is, let's raise earnings per share 4 cents this quarter, that's not the kind of thing that makes most people leap out of bed in the morning.
Profit maximization.
Yeah, or, leap out of bed in the morning. Oh, I'm going to race to work to do something amazing so we can increase EPS 4 cents. And I think what you're saying
want to meet that person.
is the rise of what you might call the purpose motive.
Well, let's go further with this. What are the implications for your theories on the current economic situation? How do we entrepreneur ourselves out of this if we have Motivation 2.0 in place when we really need Motivation 3.0?
I think it raises some really, really, really big questions.
And I know entrepreneur is not a verb, so I'm sorry for that.
Sure, why not? We can make it a verb.
We'll make it one for today.
Well, and I'm glad that you mentioned entrepreneurs because one of the mythologies about entrepreneurs is that they're doing it because they want to make a lot of money and they're trying. Most entrepreneurs typically, and there's a huge body of research to back this up, along with anecdotes, entrepreneurs are some of the most purpose-driven people. They see something wrong with the world and want to fix it. And so if you talk to the great entrepreneurs, the Steve Jobs, they say, we want to put a ding in the universe. And so so entrepreneurs are very purposeful. I think what's happened is that we've seen one reason the economy ran off the rails is that we had a lot of very, very high stakes payoffs for very short-term gains. And no sense of how it connected to the rest of the system, and that almost ran us off. I mean, it almost ran us off the rails. So I think that we're seeing the inadequacy of. I think we're seeing the dangers of that when the profit motive comes unmoored from the purpose motive. There, you have ethical challenges. The other thing is that if you look at how companies are performing, I think there's a sense that there's a kind of turning of the page. That there's like. We realize, okay, we can't keep doing things in exactly the same way, that this endless cycle of boom and bust that we seem to be having over the last 15 or 20 years, we can't just, I think people are saying, that can't be, quote unquote, normal.
But we also see a rise in resistance to change.
Oh, people hate change. But, it's, although, I'll quote the noted philosopher, John McCarthy, who runs the Home Run Baseball Clinic here in Washington, D.C., who says, people don't change when they see the light, they change when they feel the heat. Mm-hmm. Great line. And I think that we're feeling the heat now, that we're recognizing that this endless pursuit of short-term gain isn't healthy. It's not good for companies. And again, I mean, I hate to keep falling back on the research and the science, but if you look at something like corporate governance, there's research out there that shows that companies that spend the most resources giving guidance on short-term earnings actually have lower long-term growth rates. They're so fixated on the short term, they don't invest in R&D, research and development, or other kinds of things that lead to lasting growth. So I think there's a kind of,
And yet they keep doing it. So how do you break the logjam?
I think it's very, very difficult. I think you break it in some sense, one action, one conversation at a time. So
when you're out there meeting with business groups, business leaders, are they receptive to your message? Do they acknowledge I need to change?
Surprisingly, yes, because it goes back to something we were talking about earlier, because I think there is a sense that we kind of know this in our guts. That we have
intuitive sense that's not working.
It's not working, and that if you see something that's not working, here we have demonstrable evidence that this endless regimen of carrots and sticks has failed. It fails before our very eyes, and at a certain point, you have to say maybe we should try something different. Instead, we've been saying, oh, carrots and sticks failed again. Looks like we need more carrots,
more sticks.
Right. And I also think it has to do. I'll tell you one very interesting little anecdote here. There's a company that it's not in the book, but I'll write about it when I do a follow-up. It's a British company that did something crazy. They eliminated commissions for their salespeople. Seems insane. And because they felt like the compensation scheme was basically people were doing things only for the compensation scheme, not to actually do anything good. So they said, we'll eliminate sales commissions, raise people's base salary, give people profit sharing. So they weren't cutting people's pay. And so the CEO very skittishly presented this to his sales leaders. First sales leader, I don't know what the person's name was, Fred. Fred, we're thinking about eliminating sales commissions. But instead, we'll replace it with a higher base salary and profit sharing at the end of the year. What do you think, Fred? Fred, that's actually not a bad idea. It might increase collaboration. It would make, I think, our salespeople less worried at the end of the month if they're not having a good month, make them less desperate. I think it's not a bad idea to try. The problem is that Maria, the other salesperson, main salesperson, she'll never go for it because Maria only cares about money. Go to ask Maria. Maria, eliminate sales commissions, raise base salary, profit sharing. What do you think? Well, that's a pretty good idea. I think it's better for our customers. I think it would increase collaboration. The problem is that Fred will never go for it because Fred only cares about money. And what you had is you had everybody making these false assumptions about each other and not saying, well, maybe these people actually...
More in common than they thought.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to report, Dan, that our time is very short. We only about a minute left. But I wanted to ask you about sort of the outliers or the leaders. What industries or companies or countries or individuals are on the cutting edge here, are the ones who are getting this right?
Yeah, I think it's generally, I think it's younger companies. Rather than older companies, but that's not uniformly the case. And it's not really an industry, but you often see it in technology, not because it's technology, but because it's younger and because it's very, very talent-driven. So you look at a place like Google, which has 20% time. People can spend 20% of their time working on whatever they want. There's a software company in Australia that I read about called Atlassian, where people have these 1 days where they can do whatever they want. Created all kinds of innovation from that. There's a well-known American company called Zappos, a shoe retailer, online shoe retailer, that lets its, has its call center representatives answer calls however they want. No script, no monitoring, no timing, radical amounts of autonomy. Best Buy and its corporate headquarters has gone to essentially a radical no schedule. People show up whenever they want. And so there are, on the fringes out there, something really interesting and big happening.
Well, you're making a lot of people in the workplace excited with this and a lot of managers nervous.
Good.
That's great. That's a good thing. Dan, thanks very much.
Thanks,
Continued
John.
success. To those of you watching on MHZ or listening on radio, we appreciate your comments and encourage you to share them with us. And you can do so by sending email to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. We'll return next week with another edition of Dialogue. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining us.
Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.
Next week on Dialogue.
I've built common ground. What the book is trying to do is build robust common ground, but it's robust ground. It's not a load of mush, right?
Yeah.
And so we're going to lose the fringes on each end. And so the romantic environmentalists, we're going to wave bye-bye to them. They're the people who think that people are there for nature rather than nature's there for people. They're there. They want to just preserve.
The curator model.
The natural artifacts in a museum where curators hand it on. We're not curators of a set of natural artifacts. We're custodians of nature's value. And sometimes the right thing to do is to turn that value into something that's more productive and let poor people dig themselves out of poverty by it.
And who is the other extreme? The so-called
other extreme
ostriches. Not an endangered species. You're not talking about ostriches.
Ostriches, they're the guys who just deny that nature is in any way special and is in any way faced by mismanagement. And they're the guys who are basically conniving in plunder. Because nature is special. And it's an area which requires regulation, governance, to avoid either the few stealing from the many or the present stealing from the future. Nature's vulnerable as well as valuable.
This polarized debate you described, unfortunately, describes much of the discourse in media, in the public arena. You think of a Sarah Palin-like figure, drill baby drill, and then her opponents in the environmental side viewing Sarah Palin as the devil. How do you get past that? How do you get to something more?
Extremes make good theatre for media. And I've built my career on trying to face down the extremes, build a powerful common ground. That's what I tried to do with the bottom billion. Get in between the guys who say, AID's the only solution, AID's the problem that's driving these people to poverty. These are just too extreme, these views. And so I've kept trying to build a large common ground, because once you build a common central ground, that's where you can get policies changed. The extremes, once you polarize, you freeze policy. And if we freeze policy, nature will just get plundered.